It was December in 1917 when the wards of Overbrook Insane Asylum fell silent under an icy chill. Inside this aging brick complex, patients huddled together desperately for warmth as the steam radiators went cold. The only boiler that the asylum had failed, and over the next 3 weeks, 24 helpless inmates froze to death in their own beds. Staff desperately tried to borrow a railroad locomotive to pump heat into the building, but the frigid cold wave gripped the hospital with a lethal force. This isn't the first or the last gruesome episode of Overbrook, an institution literally freezing its patients to death. It's just one of the many horrors that unfolded. Established in the late 19th century with high hopes, Overbrook's history became more of a chronicle of suffering, inhumanity, and neglect. The story of Overbrook is more than local lore, but a cautionary tale of how the mentally ill were treated in a bygone era, a chilling glimpse into the realities of asylum life, from deadly mismanagement and gory medical practices to the social stigma that left thousands of people vulnerable when hidden away. We'll walk through the decades of Overbrook's operation together. Welcome to Overbrook, where good intentions decayed into horror. This will not be a happy story. In any case, welcome to the channel. If you are new here, I do invite you to click that subscribe button, and liking the video and leaving a comment is always good for the engagement, so thank you in advance for that. Now, this video is completely uninterrupted. It's all ad-free, as with all the other videos on the channel, even the ones in this very playlist too for the Insane Asylum videos. This is due to the contributions on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through Super Thanks and PayPal, and also those who checked out the merch store. Thank you very much. If you would like to see any of the relevant links, they're in the pinned comment, video description, and channel description on the home page. Now, with all that being said and done, let's go back to the beginning, to the founding of Overbrook. It all starts in 1896, Essex County, New Jersey, and they purchased hundreds of acres of farmland in a spot near the Peckman River, just beyond a brook, giving rise to the nickname Overbrook. The official name was the Essex County Asylum for the Insane, intended to relieve overcrowding at Newark's City Hospital. Its design followed the progressive ideas of the late 19th century, a sprawling campus of red brick Victorian buildings, connected by over a mile of tunnels beneath the grounds. Those tunnels, stretching dark and dripping under the complex, allowed staff to move patients, supplies, and, at the worst of times, corpses, out of sight from those prying eyes. When it opened around 1898, Overbrook was hailed as a modern institution that would provide a more moral treatment, meaningful work, and fresh air to its patients. And indeed, the asylum tried to be self-sufficient and even uplifting. It featured a working farm, workshops, a power plant, and even a theater for patient activities. Overbrook was so large and integral that it became a town within a town. It had its own train station as well on the Erie Railroad Caldwell line, built to haul massive coal deliveries for the boilers. Patients tended vegetable fields and dairy cows on the asylum's expansive farmlands, producing food for their own meals as a form of occupational therapy. There was even a bakery, a firehouse, and even a semi-professional baseball team made up of a mix of staff and patients, which competed against local town teams. So to an outsider, Overbrook in its early years might have looked like almost a self-contained village rather than a lockup for the insane. It all seemed pretty nice. Yet, from the very beginning, there was a darker reality that lurked behind the idyllic facade. The asylum was overcrowded from day one. It seemed that no sooner had the new buildings opened that they were filled beyond their capacity. By the early 1900s, Overbrook housed well over 1,000 inmates, the contemporary term for patients, by the way. We're not using it in a modern vernacular. Well, they were also severely understaffed. This genteel, home-like care promised by reformers proved difficult to deliver with numbers like that. Just not enough hands to deal with everyone. Signs of neglect and abuse began to surface almost immediately. In 1910, a state grand jury investigated the conditions at Overbrook and issued a pretty scathing report. The jurors found the asylum was mismanaged and, quote, gross immorality existed in the institution, with nurses and attendants accused of abusing patients. But even more alarming, the county freeholders, that is, the officials in charge, were said to have ignored or even covered up these crimes. Although details were sparse in the newspapers, the phrase gross immorality in that era often implied cases of SA, or severe ethical breaches. In short, just a decade after opening, Overbrook was already mired in scandal. The lofty vision of enlightened care had all but given way to something more akin to a custodial warehouse, where the suffering were just shoved in the corners to fester away out of sight. Locals tellingly nicknamed Overbrook the Bin, as if it were a place to discard society's unwanted people. Well, this early period certainly established a pattern, not off to a good start. Overbrook's history would oscillate between public ideals and hidden horror, all too often with the latter winning out. But the most infamous tragedy is the one that we mentioned in the introduction. So let's talk about that. Go back to December 1917. As World War I raged overseas, a bitter cold snap hit New Jersey. On December 1st, 1917, the asylum's aging heating plant completely shut down, leaving the sprawling complex with no steam heat and no electric light. Overnight, the radiators went silent, and the timing couldn't have been worse. That month brought some of the coldest winter weather on record. Inside Overbrook's massive dormitory wards, thin blanket-clad patients woke up shivering. Day after day, the wards remained unheated, effectively turning into freezing cells. Inmates huddled in their coats indoors and slept two to a bed to share bodily warmth. But the cold was relentless. The administrators were desperate, and they tried to frantically improvise. They brought in oil stoves and haphazard braziers. At one point, the superintendent even tried to borrow that locomotive engine from a railroad to pipe in steam for the heat, an almost absurd measure of a last resort. But the efforts were too little, too late. Over the 20 days following December 1st, 24 patients died from exposure or related illnesses brought on by the cold. According to a New York Times report, that was 3 times the normal death rate for that month. Or at least 32 other patients had suffered from frostbite injuries during those weeks. Many of the victims quite literally just froze to death in their beds, as later accounts put it, found in the morning just stiff as a board. And just think about the horror of that. Men and women who were already mentally ill, locked up in an asylum, slowly dying of hypothermia in an iron cot, unattended throughout the night. Now that's a cruel fate that you'd think you'd find in a medieval dungeon, not a 20th century hospital. But it is what it is. Public outrage, of course, followed, especially once the press broke the story. The plight of 1,800 insane patients without heat. That was the headline. Now that ought to sell some papers, that's for sure. Overbrook's superintendent admitted to families that conditions were far from comfortable, that's to say the least. In fact, he went so far to send letters urging families to please come and retrieve their relatives if possible. So imagine that desperation behind that request. The hospital effectively conceded that it could not keep its patients alive, begging next of kin to step in and relieve the burden. Of course, many patients just had nowhere else to go. Their families either could not care for them or had long since abandoned them to institutional life. Once again, those society's unwanted undesirables just shoved into the dustbin. Those vulnerable souls remained trapped at Overbrook as the temperatures indoors fell below freezing. An official inquiry later assigned blame to the mechanical failure and inadequate emergency planning. But there were deeper issues that were quite evident. The catastrophe reflected institutional neglect. The county had underfunded maintenance and infrastructure for years, and there was no contingency for heating a vast complex in winter. The staff-to-patient ratio was also so poor that many patients were likely not closely monitored, even as they grew lethargic and ill. The 1917 winter tragedy stands out as one of the deadliest incidents in American asylum history, comparable to the worst hospital fires or epidemics of that era. And the thing is, it was a preventable horror. Afterward, Overbrook did upgrade its boilers and backup systems, but it was a lesson hard learned. The grim legacy of that winter would not be forgotten, and I dare say every winter rolling around would be met with quite a dose of nervousness. Well, locals would later claim to hear ghostly echoes in the halls. Maybe it's the final cries of those who perished in the frost. Well, whether or not you believe in ghosts, the fact remains that 24 people died needlessly due to mismanagement and indifference and poor maintenance. Another chilling reminder, quite literally chilling, of how vulnerable these inmates of the asylums were to bureaucratic failures. A little bit of underfunding, someone who doesn't want to see to all of their patients, or simply just understaffing, can have very real-world results. Now, if the 1917 disaster revealed lethal negligence, the 1920s brought episodes that highlighted blatant malpractice and even violence. One particularly gory scandal emerged in 1923 when a nurse was arrested and charged with manslaughter of her role in the deaths of 2 patients. Anna Rosenzweig, a senior nurse at Overbrook, had been performing forced feedings on severely mentally ill women who refused to eat. Now, force feeding wasn't just at Overbrook. It was a common, if dangerous, practice in asylums at the time. Patients who wouldn't eat voluntarily might be restrained and fed via a rubber tube or a funnel, essentially forcefully pouring liquid food into them. In Rosenzweig's case, something went horribly wrong. 2 women died during these brutal feeding sessions. The Jersey Journal reported on October 26, 1923, that the Essex nurse held for the death of 2 women, detailing that Rosenzweig was indicted after an autopsy showed the patients had choked and died from exhaustion and trauma during the struggle. In court, Overbrook's administration actually defended the practice of force feeding, calling it a necessary measure for the more difficult cases. However, the fact that a nurse was charged with homicide shows just how egregious this situation was. Essentially, patients were being violently treated to death, and the image of a patient thrashing against restraints, suffocating on a mixture of gruel as a nurse forces it down their throat. Well, that's a pretty grim illustration of the malpractice that could occur behind these asylum walls. This case also exposed the culture of impunity that often reigned in such institutions. It took 2 fatalities for authorities to finally take notice of a practice that likely injured many others in silence. Another shocking incident of the 1920s showed the dangers posed by patient escapes and the porous security at Overbrook. In June of 1925, a young man named Harrison Knoll made a daring escape from the asylum, one of the numerous escapes that year. In fact, 14 other patients had recently fled and were unaccounted for around that time. Now, Knoll was pretty young. He was only 18 years old, the privileged son of a wealthy New York family and a former Harvard student. Yet he suffered from what doctors called dementia praecox, an old term for schizophrenia, and had been committed after a violent incident in which he attacked his own father with an axe. Yeah, certainly get him out of the house after that one, that's for sure. Once free from Overbrook's supervision, Knoll's disturbed mind led him to commit heinous crimes that grabbed headlines across the region. In early September 1925, armed and erratic, Knoll shot and killed a taxi driver in cold blood, apparently just to steal the man's car. The following day, he used that stolen vehicle to perpetuate an even more horrifying act. He abducted a 6-year-old girl named Mary Daly off the street in a nearby town of Montclair. Well, when a ransom attempt failed, Knoll brutally shot the little girl, hiding her body in the bushes on a mountainside. Well, the public was rightfully outraged and terrified. Knoll was soon caught, and he freely confessed to the killings, being transferred to the state psychiatric facility at Greystone Park, deemed outrageously and dangerously insane. The aftermath brought intense scrutiny on Overbrook. How exactly could an unstable murderer simply walk out of a supposedly secure hospital? The Essex County Board of Freeholders fired Overbrook's senior resident physician, Dr. John Thompson, holding him responsible for the escape and lax oversight that enabled Knoll's rampage. And this whole episode just shows both the threat to society posed by mismanaged asylums and threat to patients themselves. So I suppose in a way that Knoll, too, was kind of a victim of Overbrook's failings, a psychotic young man who, rather than receiving effective care, found an opportunity to unleash his madness upon others. In any case, the incident fueled public perceptions of insane asylum inmates as dangerous and fed the stigma around mental illness. It also highlighted that Overbrook's problems went far beyond these internal abuses. They could literally spill out into the community in the form of violence. Throughout the 1920s, Overbrook continued to operate under a cloud of such troubling events. Periodic reports surfaced of patient abuse, staff corruption, and even people taking their own lives within the very grounds. The stigma around the institution grew. Families of the mentally ill often felt shame in having a relative at the bin. Well, if a patient died there under questionable circumstances, it might simply just be written off as the inevitable fate of the insane. And so we see by the close of the 1920s, an asylum struggling with its identity, caught between portraying itself as a humane medical facility and functioning in reality as a custodial warehouse where extreme measures like heavy restraint, force feeding, were just the routine. The worst incidents, Rosenzweig's lethal force feeding or Noel's escape, pierced the veil and gave the public this rare look at the horror within the walls of Overbrook. The 1930s dawned, and they brought even new challenges that would push Overbrook to its breaking point. If you're familiar with the period, you'll know what happened. The Great Depression had devastated the American economy, and social services were strained to the limit. For thousands of destitute and desperate people, mental hospitals became a refuge of last resort. Overbrook, being a county asylum, saw a surge of admissions during the Depression years. Homeless individuals or those simply unable to be cared for by impoverished families ended up behind the asylum's gates. By the late 1930s, the population swelled into the thousands, far beyond its intended capacity. Contemporary accounts describe large numbers of homeless finding refuge there during the Depression, with the result that overcrowding was extreme and food was heavily rationed. Well, in plain terms, Overbrook became a human warehouse for society's most vulnerable. The elegant dining halls and airy dormitories envisioned in the 1890s were now jam-packed with beds, people just sleeping wherever they could. And indeed, photographs from later decades showed day rooms and hallways crammed with cots and mattresses, every available space turned into a makeshift ward. Patients slept shoulder to shoulder in rows, and privacy and dignity were all but non-existent. With overcrowding came severe neglect. The asylum's budget did not keep pace with the population boom, and staffing remained woefully inadequate. Nurses and orderlies struggled to supervise, feed, and care for so many souls. Basic living conditions deteriorated. Reports spoke of filthy wards, infestations of vermin, and patients wearing tattered, hand-me-down clothing. Food shortages, too, meant that meals were a thin soup kind of thing, or perhaps a gruel, and malnutrition became a quiet killer behind the high walls. Heavily rationed food made living conditions very poor, the kind of thing that was, well, expected in the worst of the Depression-era hospitals of the time. And in some cases, patients truly starved, or at least became severely underweight, their health further undermined by such privation. Neglect took several forms as well. Accounts of this period mention patients wandering off the grounds, untreated illnesses, and a spike of deaths from very preventable causes. Overbrook's mortality rate climbed, contributing to an astonishing cumulative death toll by some estimates of over 10,000 people dying within Overbrook's walls over the centuries of operation. Many of those deaths occurred in the 30s and 40s, the peak years of overcrowding and poor care. The social stigma of mental illness unfortunately meant that these deaths and conditions attracted very little outside attention. Families often didn't or couldn't advocate for institutionalized relatives, especially if they were penniless. Some patients in Overbrook had no family at all. They were essentially forgotten people. But Overbrook did maintain a cemetery for those unclaimed by relatives. It even had a small crematorium on site by some accounts. A grim necessity, given how many perished anonymously. And it is telling that even as people died in droves, public concern was quite minimal. The attitude of the era was that the insane asylum was a world unto itself. Unless a scandal broke into the newspapers, county asylums operated with scant oversight. Overbrook's administrators rarely had to answer to anyone for the everyday misery within. This allowed a culture of indifference to take hold among some staff, and indeed we hear occasional anecdotes of kindness, a nurse or doctor doing their best under the tough circumstances, but also many tales of patients left in soiled bedding for days, or locked in seclusion cell for weeks without proper monitoring. Unfortunately, there were more bad stories than good ones. By 1931, conditions had become so dire that even local newspapers began to question the situation. Indeed, a Jersey Journal article from May 1931 apparently highlighted the issues at Overbrook, suggesting that public awareness was growing. The freeholders who ran Essex County faced criticism for funding a luxurious new home for the asylum's farm overseers, while patients lacked basic necessity. This juxtaposition, spending on appearances while inmates suffered, certainly encapsulated the misplaced priorities. Like many asylums of the Depression era, Overbrook tried outwardly to protect an image of order and self-sufficiently, proudly noting its farm production and all the other little activities, even as it was very obviously sinking into internal chaos and depravity. An especially haunting statistic emerges from this time. As many as 150 patients from Overbrook in the 30s and 40s went missing. And what does that mean? Let's use some other words. Due to poor record keeping and lax supervision, a large number of patients either escaped or just wandered off, and the hospital just could not account for them. In fact, many of the staff might have been relieved it was just one less mouth to feed, one less person to take care of. Some of these missing may have died anonymously on the outside. Others possibly assimilated into the homeless populations. But the fact that 150 people essentially just vanished from a mental hospital is a stunning indicator of disorder, especially with that earlier guy who killed that little girl and taxi driver. Well, that suggests that staff at Overbrook could lose track of people entirely. That's a very horrifying thought. In any case, by the end of the 1930s, Overbrook had truly earned its dark reputation. It was a place where human lives were just lost in the shuffle, quietly and routinely. If one walked the halls at that time, the sights would be pitiful. Rows of forlorn faces, some psychotic and wailing, others nearly catatonic, tended by overworked nurses in a now crumbling facility. The smell of unwashed bodies and strong disinfectant permeated the air. The social stigma around the insane, as broad as that definition was back in those days, meant that few outsiders ever saw these conditions, and those who did, the occasional inspector or journalist, often described them with terms like dismal and squalid. Overbrook had become, in effect, just another dumping ground for the unwanted, confirming the worst fears of its unwanted nickname, the bin. And yet, even worse times were ahead, as a new wave of patients arrived with the next great generational upheaval, World War II. The end of World War II in 1945 brought a surge of new patients to Overbrook, driving its population to an all-time high, and ushering in an era of both extreme overcrowding and aggressive psychiatric treatments. Among the influx were many war veterans suffering from the old cold shell shock, what we recognize now as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. These were young men haunted by a combat trauma, for whom few effective treatments existed at the time. We were still trying to figure all of that out back then. Overbrook, it was already strained, and they suddenly found themselves tasked with caring for scores of psychologically wounded soldiers, in addition to its regular, chronically mentally ill population. By the 1940s, the asylum housed over 2,000 patients at any given time, sometimes even nearing 3,000. To put that in perspective, Overbrook was operating as a massive psychiatric facility, larger than many small towns. The staff was stretched to breaking point, and neglect became almost institutionalized. One post-war account described how 150 patients disappeared during the period. That's what we've heard, and we mentioned that earlier, and that certainly gives a sense of how much worse things can get after that. Keeping track of everyone was simply a losing battle, and it's in the context of that severe overcrowding that Overbrook, like other mid-century asylums, resorted to or even embraced the era's most drastic psychiatric treatments. What had been state-of-the-art care in the 1890s, fresh air, work, and gentle routines, had by the 1940s given way to the medicalized interventions of a new age, many of them cruel and frightening in hindsight. Overbrook's wards saw widespread use of electroconvulsive therapy, insulin coma therapy, and even prefrontal lobotomy in the late 40s and early 50s. These methods were considered cutting-edge technology for severe mental illness at the time. But as we know now, they more often than not just caused more suffering. Electroconvulsive therapy, for instance, was administered by strapping patients down and delivering strong electrical shocks to the brain to induce seizures. In the 1940s, ECT was typically done without adequate anesthesia or muscle relaxants. Patients would often scream or moan in terror when dragged to the shock room, and afterwards they might emerge disoriented, with bruises or bitten tongues from the convulsion. Overbrook used this treatment extensively. Photographs even showed demonstrations of the procedure at the asylum. While some patients did benefit, ECT can relieve severe depression. Many others were traumatized by the process. One nurse who worked at Overbrook in this era later recalled a personal experience. As a young girl living next door, she used to hear the patient's screams at night. And later, as an Overbrook nurse, she claimed that she was the one who made them scream by administering electroshock and insulin treatments herself. Well, that quote, "I made them scream," captures the horror of the well-intended practitioners inflicting pain under that guise of therapy. Transformation from empathetic neighbor to an agent of agony. Insulin coma therapy was another brutal regimen employed at Overbrook. In this treatment, patients, often those with schizophrenia, were injected with massive doses of insulin to induce daily comas. Nurses would then revive them with sugar after a period of unconsciousness. This process often caused violent seizures as blood sugar plummeted, and patients had to be restrained to prevent injury. It was a frightening roller coaster of consciousness that could lead to brain damage or even death if not carefully monitored. Overbrook reportedly used insulin therapy in abundance in the 40s. We can only imagine the dread that those patients felt, knowing each morning they'd be forced into a coma and perhaps wake up groggy, confused, and sore, only to endure it again and again in a multi-week course. But of course, the worst is saved for last. The most infamous was the use of lobotomy. Lobotomy was a neurosurgical procedure that involved severing connections in the frontal lobes of the brain, often via an ice pick instrument inserted through the eye socket. This procedure was seen as a last resort cure for the incurable mentally ill, and it swept through the American asylums after the Second World War, championed by neurologist Walter Freeman and others. Of course, Overbrook was just no exception. Hospital archives and oral histories indicate that multiple patients underwent lobotomies at Overbrook in the late 40s and early 50s. The surgery left many in a vegetative or childlike state. And while a few became more docile, which was often the goal in the overcrowded wards, others suffered seizures, a loss of personality, or severe cognitive impairments. It was, in all truth, just a form of medicalized violence, permanently altering a person's brain and identity. Seeing a lobotomy patient, vacant eyes, scarred forehead, and zero personality, now that must have been a truly grim sight. During this peak post-war period, Overbrook's everyday environment was arguably at its worst. Not only were the wards packed and often dirty, but the sounds and sights of this treatment could be as disturbing as the untreated symptoms. One might walk into a ward and find patients in wet packs, that is a form of hydrotherapy where patients were wrapped tightly in cold wet sheets for hours. Down another hall you might hear the crackle of the ECT machine, perhaps a muffled cry underneath it. In the infirmary, rows of insulin coma patients lay sweating and ashy, nurses rushing to each with glucose to pull them back from the brink of death. Now the more restful scenes would be patients herded into occupational therapy workshops, shelling peas from the asylum farm, or sewing hospital linens. Monotonous labor meant to occupy the mind. Overbrook followed the trends of its time to the letter. Whatever experimental or extreme therapy was in vogue, they tried it. And always, there was the specter of abuse alongside treatment. With so many patients and so little oversight, individual cases of cruelty continued. Attendants might beat a troublesome patient in a secluded corner, or a predatory staff member might take advantage of a vulnerable female patient. The very gross immorality decried in 1910 likely persisted on in the shadows. But it is important to note that not all was unrelentingly bleak. There were staff at Overbrook who did genuinely try to help and believe these treatments were at the cutting edge of psychiatry. After all, that's what they were learning in the schools, right? But with hindsight, we understand that the barbarity of many of these methods entailed. Overbrook's mid-century chapter is thus a bit of a paradox, you see. A time of medical innovation that was in many ways just another form of horror visited upon the helpless. It was said that over 10,000 patients died over the decades, and a good number of those deaths occurred during those years due to botched treatments, side effects, and of course, sheer neglect. And that social stigma in the mid-century was as strong as ever. Families would not bring the mentally ill loved ones home, even if they improved slightly, due to shame or perhaps fear. So Overbrook's population only slowly declined when finally the outside world changed its approach to mental health in the 50s and 60s. So by the early 60s, the era of that giant asylum was drawing to a close. Long gone were those days of those big imposing Victorian buildings stretched out on those country estates. It was just changing. And there were a series of developments that dramatically altered the fate of not just places like Overbrook, but just asylums in general. First, the introduction of effective psychiatric medications. And I say effective. They had a few things before, but there's that key word again. Now, especially the antipsychotic drug, chloroprosamine, also known as Thorazine, around 1955. Now, this drug allowed many severely ill patients to be treated without constant confinement. And if they don't need constant confinement, then they don't need an asylum. You see where I'm getting at here? Or patients who had spent years in straitjackets, which by this time were very frowned upon too, or even locked wards could now be calmed with a daily pill. This medical breakthrough started to chip away at Overbrook's census. Now, the second big thing that happened was kind of a growing reform movement in mental health care, fueled by exposés of asylum conditions and a philosophical shift toward community-based care. In 1963, the U.S. federal government passed the Community Mental Health Act, encouraging the creation of local clinics and the release of patients from large state hospitals. Now, we have to say, while Overbrook was a county facility rather than a state facility, it was still swept up in the general trend of deinstitutionalization. The push to discharge long-term patients to smaller and less isolated settings when possible was the growing trend. Now, throughout the 60s and 70s, Overbrook's wards steadily emptied. Slowly but surely, things were getting less and less crowded. No longer were new cases of mental illness automatically just funneled into the asylum system. Many patients who weren't considered dangerous were released to family homes, group homes, or simply just the streets, unfortunately leading to a rise in homelessness for some, which is a whole different problem. Well, by the 1970s, the once crowded dormitories of Overbrook had whole wings closed off, gathering dust. The hospital limped along with a shrinking population consisting of only the most chronic or severe cases, or people with just nowhere else to go. Photos from the late 70s show paint peeling off the walls, wheelchairs sitting empty in abandoned corridors, or perhaps you'll see a lone nurse overseeing a near-empty ward. In 1975, Overbrook ceased being called an asylum and was finally rebranded Essex County Hospital Center, trying to shake off a bit of the stigma. But the new name could not fully wash away the past. As for the conditions, they did improve in these later decades somewhat, if only because fewer patients meant less crowding and more attention per person, that kind of thing. The notorious treatments like lobotomy, well, they were long gone. Lobotomies had largely stopped in the late 1950s, put down to quack science, all the rest. Now, what about the electroshock therapy? Well, that continued, but it was a lot more regulated, and they refined it somewhat to include anesthesia, which makes things a little bit more pleasant. Still, some harsh practices lingered. Restraints and seclusion were used on those few who were deemed violent, and stories circulated of patients essentially warehoused in back rooms forgotten by time. A degree of institutional inertia kept Overbrook going, even as its purpose eroded. For those remaining residents, many of whom had been there for, well, even some up to 50 years, Overbrook was the only home that they knew. Where else were they going to go? You couldn't just let them out into the world. Well, this included some truly tragic figures who had entered as young men or women in the 30s, and after a lifetime behind those walls, were elderly and frail by the 80s. And what are you going to do with them? What kind of life do you expect them to have after this? Those poor souls. If only they were born a generation later. Oh well, it is what it is. Well, also the physical decay of the campus accelerated too. I suppose you can say that within that sunset era of the hospital, and people didn't really bother painting the walls, keeping up with the maintenance. As for those tunnels, they flooded and became impassable. Buildings were condemned one by one. It was as if the asylum was dying. By the year 2000, Overbrook's active operations had been consolidated into just a couple of buildings on one corner of the property. The vast majority of the campus lay abandoned, taken over by mildew, moss, and rodents. Nature began to creep back in. Trees growing through windows, wild vines crawling up the brick facades. A poignant image from this time is a patient's old Christmas card found on a nightstand in an empty ward, next to dusty beds that hadn't been slept in for years. Artifacts like that, this kind of modern archaeology, it kind of shows the human side of it, doesn't it? All those people who had filled those rooms once, their voices now lost to time. Well, finally in 2007, Overbrook officially closed its doors for good. Essex County had built a brand new psychiatric hospital nearby, a modern and smaller facility, and the last remaining patients were transferred there. So after 111 years, a nice, neat little number, Overbrook Asylum was no more. The sprawling bin was left to the elements and to memory. In the years immediately after the closure, the site attracted plenty of urban explorers, historians, and thrill seekers who snuck in despite police patrols. They wandered the decaying labyrinth of Overbrook and found themselves understandably awestruck by what was left behind. Stacks of molding patient records in the basement, hundreds of rusting bed frames and wheelchairs, locks on doors that once kept people in, and walls painted with murals of idyllic landscapes peeling away, kind of ironic attempt to brighten up the wards in later years. The very emptiness of Overbrook is a kind of haunting image in itself. One explorer noted that even without any ghosts, the air hung heavy in the halls, remorse impossible to escape when you know what transpired here. In 2018, the abandoned buildings were finally demolished, erasing the physical structure of Overbrook from the landscape for good. And in its place today, there are county parks and suburban townhouses. Very ordinary, very peaceful, just like nothing ever happened. But the legacy of Overbrook, its horrors, and its lessons, well, that's a little bit harder to remove. I don't think that's going anywhere for a long time. So the story of Overbrook, what can we really say about it? It's kind of a microcosm of the broader history of mental health care in the last century. It's a journey from optimism to agony, from moral treatment to outright horror, and eventually toward reform, however imperfect. It certainly rhymes with the other American asylums that we've covered. Overbrook became as a symbol of hope, an enlightened new sanctuary for the inflicted, but it became this infamous place for exactly what it was meant to prevent: suffering, neglect, and the abuse of the mentally ill. And then there's the very hard-to-ignore 10,000 people that died at Overbrook in those 111 years. And that's a staggering toll. It invites us to mourn not only the individuals, but just this overall failure of a system. These were people who, due to illness and societal stigma, were virtually just discarded in a massive institution, many of them just dying alone, behind closed doors, unknown to the world outside. Of course, we don't have 10,000 stories to tell, but the only ones that we have uncovered are heartrending. A patient freezing to death in 1917, the two women force-fed until they expired. And that little girl, that poor little soul murdered by an escaped inmate. Not to mention the soldiers with shattered minds languishing in the overcrowded wards, and the countless men and women subjected to shock, insulin coma, and lobotomy in the name of cure. Now, if that's not the stuff of nightmares, I don't know what it is. It makes it even worse that it happened under the imprimatur of medicine and public policy. So what lessons can we really draw from it? Well, one is the effect of social stigma and isolation. For decades, mental illness was so feared and reviled that society was content to lock sufferers in places like Overbrook and then just look the other way. This allowed atrocities to occur, largely unchecked. Inmates had virtually no voice, and if they cried out, and many did, literally screaming in pain or despair, their cries were contained by thick walls and ignored by those outside. Another lesson is about the danger of institutional scale and bureaucracy. Overbrook grew to house thousands, far beyond the capacity for human care, and when any facility becomes that large and impersonal, well, people just become numbers. Basic humanity can be lost. They just don't have time for it. The cruelty was often not deliberate evil by individuals, but rather the cold neglect of an overtaxed and underfunded machine. Of course, there were also instances of real cruelty, staff who abused their power. But they only got away with that because the system that they operated within enabled it. And finally, the arc of Overbrook's story does hold a glimmer of redemption, in that it ended. The asylum era gave way to a new approach that, while still facing challenges, at least aims to treat patients as humans deserving of dignity and community integration. Overbrook's demise was part of the broader closure of such asylums across America in the late 20th century. In a way, the crumbling of Overbrook's buildings was a physical manifestation of those changing values, the old edifice of neglect literally falling apart. Some former patients, freed by deinstitutionalization, did sadly end up homeless or in prisons, a modern tragedy of its own. But others found better lives in group homes or with family. It's a bit of a roll of the dice. Not everybody gets a 6. Well, mental health care today operates on very different principles, of course, than in Overbrook's heyday. And yet, the ghosts of Overbrook remain, metaphorically, and some would say quite literally. Locals and ghost hunters have spun many tales about the spirits of deceased patients roaming the abandoned halls, or a nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, still doing her rounds, still tending to those who need her. Well, the ghost stories are certainly tantalizing. And one might argue that the real haunting is the historical memory itself, the tragedy, the pain, the injustice that occurred at Overbrook. Nothing casts a longer shadow than that, and you certainly don't need to argue about it as much as you do with ghosts. So when we walk in the park now that covers the asylum grounds, or drive past the condos built where the wards once stood, you tread on the ground that witnessed profound human misery. So in closing, it's not just a catalogue of gruesome events, but a series of historical lessons. It prompts us to question how we treat those with mental illness today, and ensure that the sins of the past are not repeated. Well, if anything, we've learned through our explorations into insane asylums. Who knows, one day it might be you who's misunderstood. You who has a bad day. Something terribly wrong happens in your life and you just react to it poorly. And all of a sudden you're thrown in a freezing dark hole like Overbrook. Let us hope that does not happen to anybody here. Now, that being said, we are at the end of our video for today. Really do hope you enjoyed it. As I said, it's not a very happy story, but, well, we rarely have very happy stories in history, don't we? Usually a large group of people dying or suffering or something. But as they do say, life is just suffering. In any case, I will read out the top tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, and Gary. Thank you so much. Right, that's it from me for tonight. And if you want more insane asylum stuff, well, refer to the playlist. I have playlists of everything on this channel. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time.